wants to come back on that. I mean, I think these are two big questions that I would welcome your comments on. One is indeed the Corsia link, and something on the sequencing there, because these are, I mean, these discussions within ICAO and here under the UNFCCC are proceeding in parallel. So how does that potentially play out? And the second question is indeed, so what if there's no deal on Article 6 this year? What does that mean on a very practical level for existing projects, for the start of new projects, for, well, this is a source of climate finance, for climate ambition? Who wants to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words about that. And so, I mean, starting from the Corsia link, I fully agree with Gilles. We do need rules that make sure that there is no double counting between the two systems, and there are good provisions in the draft text right now to make sure that whatever goes to Corsia in terms of mitigation outcomes has to go through the same accounting and reporting as if it was going to another NDC. And I think that that is a crucial bit to make sure that there is no double counting in the two systems. And having clarity on that from the UNFCCC process, I think, will also help the Corsia process under ICAO to get to a final decision more quickly. I think having more uncertainty on that will make things more difficult for ICAO too. And
Article 6 discussions then as being I guess the primary forum, and they will help shape the ICAO discussions. Is that the right way to think about it?
I think so, yeah. And in a way, it has to play out like that, especially because I think there's always been a tendency in ICAO to make sure that you know, the double counting issue was dealt with either at the UNFCCC level or at the program level. So I think clarity on that topic will have to come from those places, and so a no deal in Madrid on that will have implications on that. And I think, as Gilles was elaborating, I think it will have even more broader implications for international markets. And I think it's hard to imagine what will happen in that case. You know, if we get another year delay, it's already quite a negative outcome, because it will effectively delay everything by a year. If we end up not having an outcome on Article 6 forever, that will inevitably lead to a lot of fragmentation in approaches. I think countries will go ahead anyway and will undertake cooperation anyway, and they will be able to report that and account for that under the transparency framework, but everything will be less transparent and more fragmented.
So if I'm trying to think through the potential implications, it's not that there would be a complete stop to emission reduction projects, but you're saying it's perhaps we would see projects going ahead, we would see relationships or cooperation going ahead, but it would all be done on a, well, more bilateral or, well, multilateral, but among smaller number of players, so you would get a much more fragmented system.
Yeah, I think you will see a lot more bilateral kind of cooperation being set up, and possibly even clubs, but you will never get a global kind of mechanism as we would have under Article 6.4, or even a global framework as we would have under Article 6.2.
Jake, do you want to come back on these points?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think to largely agree, but to make the point that government's responsibilities with regard to international carbon markets don't begin and end with the Article 6 negotiations. They have to work consistently and diligently in ICAO to make sure that the units that will be used in that system are of a high level of environmental integrity, regardless of what happens in Madrid. And they have to be prepared to follow whatever rules that we develop within the Article 6 negotiations with regard to double counting. We also have to work diligently, those of us who are parties both to the Paris Agreement and to the Kyoto Protocol, to make sure that there is a smooth transition out of the Kyoto Protocol mechanism and into the Article 6 mechanism. And finally, for those of us who are participating in markets, I think there will be, for years to come, a responsibility on the part of buyers to ensure that whatever the international rules are, that they are making sure that their systems only accept offsets of and allowances of high environmental integrity, and that they're accounting very clearly and transparently through their domestic systems as well as internationally. And my guess is that part of the conversations that have started around Article 6 have brought together a lot of potential buyers and a lot of potential sellers that agree that they want carbon markets to deliver robust outcomes. And so in the absence of an agreement on Article 6, I think you will see strong signals from those buyers and sellers that want to see markets work to pursue those standards, even in the absence of something that emerges immediately under Paris.
Okay, so just come back to the link between Article 6 and the ICAO or CORSIA discussions. You see those as proceeding more hand in hand. It's not that one is setting the tone and the other's following. I mean, as you say, I mean, governments are present in both. So that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking about those.
I mean, each institution has the responsibility to set the rules for its regime. And we expect governments to show leadership in both contexts. Where their rules intersect is in the issue of double counting. Essentially, they both have to be clear to each other so that when parties are accounting under Paris, if something has been used towards CORSIA, our rules make sure it can't also be used towards the achievement of an NDC. That's where the rules intersect. Okay.
And then two other questions. One is, I suppose, coming back to this idea of, how bad is it if we have no deal? To what extent, I mean, I guess not everything needs to be sorted at this next COP. Not everything needs to perhaps be decided at the UN level. The EU or other regions can, to some extent, I mean, work with the basic set of rules and build upon those to ensure credits of high quality. I mean, do you see scope for I have to phrase the question, but do you see scope for the EU to play? Well, maybe one question is there going to be any discussion about accepting offsets into the EU in future? I mean, if we're talking about increasing our ambition, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that. Is that going to a topic that's likely to come back on the agenda here, and therefore would suggest a more active role for the EU in this entire discussion?
Well, I can only describe European climate policy as it is today. As you know, our at least 40% emissions reduction target is a domestic only target. So there's no sense that we would be using offsets to meet that target. We'll have to see how European policy develops in the future under a very ambitious set of guidance from our incoming leadership. But I would say that I think that a missing piece of this puzzle that I just wanted to emphasize again is that those parties that have been participating in carbon markets up until now, I think have become more aware as buyers of the risks of importing units of low quality and at high volume. And you will see a kind of a buyer beware reaction, even if we get good rules out of Article 6, that you're now seeing in the EU, but you're also seeing in Norway, which is, and New Zealand, all of which want to participate in carbon markets, but aren't prepared to buy just anything, even if it is sanctioned or approved by the UN.
Yeah, okay. MJ, could I come back to you for some thoughts on at what point is no deal, I guess, more interesting than a deal? And also some of I mean, we've had some more specific questions coming in over what kind of emission reduction projects would be most interesting in the context of Article 6? Would it be forestry projects? Where do you think, what kind of sectors do you think we would see the greatest emission reductions? There was a question specifically about Article 6.8 and RED, so again, linked to forestry. Yeah, any thoughts on that? Like where could it be most effective, and what about no deal?
Well, I'm happy to speak to the first collection of issues that you raised, the sort of the no deal situation. I suppose for EOSIS, the key thing is environmental integrity, right? Like we've been quite clear that to the extent you might see carryover of KP units, that would undermine the ambition of the NDCs that you have. To the extent you know, we don't put corresponding adjustments in place for all transfers, then we're undermining the environmental integrity of the NDCs we already have. And we're just not in a position to be going backwards. So in a situation like that, where a text presents the option of elements that truly undermine aggregate ambition, that's just not okay. And as I mentioned previously, for us, it's very important that the tools we use are developed in a way, designed in a way that delivers more mitigation ambition. We have 6.4D. It's real language. It has to be implemented, and it has to be implemented in a sensible way. So, you know, we expect to see, you know, the rule set that we're working on actually respect the agreement that we've already reached in the Paris Agreement text. So things like that violate, you know, sort of fundamental principles and undermine NDCs and not actually take us forward. Yeah, those would be. Then we'd rather see no deal. I have to think. With respect to sectors, I'm not well placed to speak to that. EOS doesn't. We haven't had that sort of discussion around the land sector.
Okay, and specifically thinking through, I guess, the future of offsetting. The question I put to Jake as well. I mean, do you see a future for offsetting at all going forward? Even if, as you say, offsets are ultimately partially cancelled, but well, you could take that further and say finally there is no offsetting at all anymore. Simply, some countries simply pay for emission reductions at home and elsewhere.
Well, offsetting, you know, it works in a capped environment where the cap is always shrinking. It's not going to deliver much where we have a set of static NDCs, right? So, you know, pure offsetting in a context of NDCs that are going to stay in place for 5 years or 10 years isn't going to deliver net global mitigation. So that's just a problem of logic that has to be addressed. So at the UN level, we have to be doing better than investing lots of time and energy and resources and coming out, best case, even. That just doesn't make sense. So if we really want the markets to be credible, yeah, we're going to have to think about going beyond offsetting. And a partial cancellation rate does exactly that. I think, you know, even units generated under the UNFCCC that, for example, might end up getting used in CORSIA, where you've already got questions about quantifying the impact of aviation on the environment. I think, you know, there are very good reasons for embedding a bit of extra benefit in the credits that are generated under the Paris Agreement.
Okay. Gilles, do you want to give maybe come back on that, and how far do you think we can ultimately phase out offsetting? Plus the question on, sectors. I mean, there were two questions specifically on forestry. How likely is it that land use projects would be included? Also a question on how do we ensure the carbon market doesn't delay the phase out of fossil fuels, which I imagine would be thinking along the lines of you could in theory fund a project to shorten the lifespan of coal, for example. So is there scope for thinking about emission reductions in such a sense?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, there's really no room for offsetting in the future. I think it's fundamentally incompatible with the Paris Agreement, and of course, as a first step, we fully support the idea of having automatic partial cancellation to achieve ONGE or to achieve overall mitigation, because we see it exactly as a step to go towards no more offsetting. I mean, the whole logic of offsetting rests on the assumption that there is extra mitigation somewhere around the world that's not being used, which I think goes against the spirit of the Paris Agreement. I mean, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement says that NDCs should reflect the most ambitious level, the possibly most ambitious level of ambition which a country can adopt. And if this is the case, then there is no extra mitigation that can be sought for offsetting. And countries which have already adopted and decided not to rely on offsetting anymore, such as the EU, I think it would be a step backwards to now go back and decide to use offsets for more ambitious targets. On the question of which sectors, that's a really tricky question indeed. I think for forestry and land use sectors specifically, there are severe problems related to the permanence of the emission reductions and the calculation of setting baselines and basically making sure that a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. And there's kind of a misconception that a ton of CO2 stored in a tree is the same as a ton of CO2 emitted from burning fossil fuel. It's not the case, and there are well, relatively technical details about it, but there's a misconception around the whole concept. So I don't think that forestry and land use should be eligible under Article 6. And then the last one on how to avoid that Article 6 delays the fossil fuel phase out. I think it should be very clear that fossil fuel projects should not be eligible under Article 6. So even projects that would try to generate credits by making coal power plants more efficient, for example, should definitely not be eligible, as these types of projects increase the lifetime of fossil fuels. So any fossil fuel project should not be eligible under Article 6.
Okay. Stefano, I'd like to come back to you, and then to Jacob maybe to close, because we're already at 4:15. Stefano, if you want also maybe a comment, I mean, from the perspective of the private sector and what kind of investments look interesting. Also a comment on where you see the greatest potential, what kind of projects would be interesting going forward?
Yeah, thank you. And that is really a bit hard to say right now, because you know, the very fact that all parties have NDCs and parties will have to apply corresponding adjustments for transfers will, in a way, turn the whole logic of the CDM, for example, around, because in that situation, parties will want to keep their you know, the low-hanging fruits and the cheap abatement options for their own NDC achievement, and they might be only willing to sell the more expensive stuff. So I think, you know, depending on how the rules will shape up, and depending on what use parties will decide to make of Article 6, there will get a clear idea about which sectors will benefit the most, and which sectors will be more subject to Article 6 activities. There is definitely a lot of potential in some sectors. So, for example, there are studies that estimate that the forestry sector, for example, which we just talked about, can offer up to 30% of the mitigation needed to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. But it remains to be seen whether the Article 6 rules will allow to unleash that potential. We hope so, but we'll see what will come out from the process.
Okay, thank you. Jake, I want to come to you for, I think, to close us off. I don't think I put the question directly to you, but in your opinion, I suppose, yeah, what happens if, we've had some different answers, but what happens if there's no agreement? I mean, in the next couple of weeks, this will carry on. I think it was Stefano who said, well, puts us back by a year, it's going to be more fragmented, but, you know, the projects are going to come. And we keep trying. How do you, I guess, how do you see things moving forward?
Thanks. Well, yeah. Well, I guess I wanted to start by just agreeing with the comments that Stefano just made about the importance of trying to create the right incentives through the Article 6 rules, and including helping countries to recognize that with 6.4, where countries do have NDCs, the incentives should change. The use of markets should be less opportunistic and more connected with the way in which they're planning to implement their NDCs domestically. In terms of reaching a deal or not reaching a deal, I mean, I'm quite optimistic, in part because we've been putting a lot of work at the technical level and also at the heads of delegation level to try to come up with landing grounds that can meet as much as possible all the mixed expectations that parties place on markets. And so, given that we've been working hard on this for so many years, I think that we are ripe from reaching some kind of an agreement. I'm also optimistic because it's quite rare in our process that we reach no agreement. I mean, even in Katowice, the rules that we agreed on the transparency framework, and particularly this paragraph 77D, for those of you who follow the negotiations closely, you'll know that we did lock in some very important accounting principles as they apply to markets, even in Katowice. So I expect that we will get, even in the worst of circumstances, a partial deal, something that helps us to begin to operationalize the principles, but also include some kind of work program where we recognize that we have to continue to work on the details moving ahead. And in the meantime, as I said before, I think that those that care about environmental integrity in markets will use the COP to send a signal in terms of how they expect to engage either as buyers or sellers or both in carbon markets in the future, whether or not we agree absolutely robust rules at the international level.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see it's 4:20, so I think that means we have to call it a day. We can't do a virtual round of applause, but thank you very much to our 4 panelists. And a big thank you to everyone who attended this webinar for your questions sent in advance, as well as the ones that came through today. I think we did our best to answer as many of them as possible. Obviously, you're free to reach out to our panelists directly afterwards, and to our hosts, Carbon Market Watch, as well, if you have additional questions. And I think we will be hearing, certainly from Carbon Market Watch, and I imagine the others as well, we'll be hearing from much more from you from next week onwards, when COP25 begins in Madrid. So thank you all. I think what I take away, I mean, these are all difficult questions. I think we had different views on many of them. Certainly everyone seems to agree that there needs to be a clear, well, that the efficiency of carbon markets needs to translate into an increase in ambition, but differing ideas on how to secure that increase in ambition and who's responsible for it, with a very concrete proposal from MJ and Stefano, for example, saying that you see other ways beyond having a mandatory cancellation rate that could be used to secure that ambition. I think on Corsia, you all said, I mean, the Corsia talks and the Article 6 talks are both important. Stefano, you said the Article 6, perhaps giving more of the overall framework, and Corsia also then needing to obviously fit in with that. Jake, you saying you see the two really as developing hand in hand. Different ideas on what kind of projects could be most useful in future. Stefano, you pointed out the big potential of forestry credits. Gilles, you pointed out that these may not be as permanent sequestration as we would like. And I think, all the questions around if there is no deal, basically a very uncertain future for the CDM. It doesn't sound like no deal would be in anyone's interest, so things wouldn't grind to a total halt. There would be projects, there would be buyers, there would be sellers, and as Jake said, these are all people who have lived, or many of them have lived through the CDM, so there is a much greater awareness and interest in the possibility or the potential of carbon markets, and a realization that there needs to be no double counting, there needs to be environmental integrity, etc. But obviously realizing that at global level would merit from a global system as much as possible. So Jake, I wish you luck. And everyone else, enjoy COP25 and see you next time. Thank you very much.